There's a term we hear a lot in forums and one I use frequently in my videos: bottleneck. Even though it's often portrayed as incredibly critical, it's a subject that isn't actually fully grasped by many people. A mistake you'll make here has the potential to create a giant hole in your wallet. If you're curious as to why, follow me. First, let's start by defining what a bottleneck is. A bottleneck is a hardware limitation that prevents components from working together at full efficiency. You can think of it like the neck of a bottle. Let's say the data coming from the wide part is the GPU, and the next section is the CPU. When intense data from the GPU can't be processed fast enough in this narrow part of the bottle, the CPU, this returns to us as a performance loss. Since the restrictive side here is the CPU, the GPU can only perform as much as the CPU allows. For example, you might see a drop from 100 FPS to 85 FPS if your GPU gets bottlenecked. I just used the phrase "prevents hardware components from working together at full efficiency." When the term bottleneck is mentioned, the first thing that comes to mind is usually the CPU and GPU bottleneck, and that's why the term is more frequently used for this duo. However, if you pay attention to the definition, there are actually situations where the concept of a bottleneck can apply to all hardware components. Explaining all of them one by one would unnecessarily lengthen the video and might confuse you. That's why in this video, I will focus on the two issues most frequently encountered in gaming PCs: CPU and GPU bottleneck and PCI Express bottleneck. CPU and GPU bottleneck. Basically, this bottleneck can be defined as the CPU not being able to sufficiently supply the GPU with data. For example, let's take the RTX 4090 and Ryzen 5 5600 as a reference. The RTX 4090 is far too powerful of a graphics card for the Ryzen 5 5600. In this case, the Ryzen 5 5600 restricts the full potential of the RTX 4090, and the performance received in practice will likely regress to RTX 5070 levels. What you need to look at here are the CPU and GPU usage percentages. These values show how much of the hardware is actively being used, independent of FPS or general performance. Let's take any AAA game as an example, and when we think of a build with an RTX 5080 paired with the Ryzen 5 5600, you might encounter this picture: 70% GPU usage and 98% CPU usage. In this scenario, while the GPU can only use 70% of its potential, we see the CPU running almost at its limit. The further GPU usage gets from 100%, the more efficiency is lost. In this example, we can talk about roughly a 30% performance loss. The other possible scenario you might face is this: the CPU fluctuating around 75%, and the GPU fluctuating between 95% and 98% in a AAA game. In this case, there doesn't seem to be a bottleneck. The CPU has managed to balance the GPU using 75% of its power, just as intended. We can't talk about any bottleneck here. The CPU managed to balance the GPU with only 75% usage, meaning the PC is working as it should, but there is a very common mistake made here. This mistake is assuming that having the CPU at 100% usage is correct or ideal, like with the GPU. No, if a game doesn't want to use more of the CPU, you can't force it to take in more. In fact, a usage chart like CPU at 90% and GPU at 100% can even indicate a potential bottleneck in some cases, because it means the CPU is being pushed harder than normal to keep up with the GPU in that game. Another scenario that is encountered a bit less often but can be confusing is this: values that might look absurd at first glance, like CPU at 60% and GPU at 70%. We usually see this picture in esports games. The reason for this is often not the hardware, but the game itself. If everyone's FPS values are very high, this means that the game is optimized this way on purpose, meaning since the PC doesn't need more, it doesn't utilize the hardware to the maximum. However, if the opposite is true, meaning your FPS values are much lower than expected, there are other problems at play here. This could be in-game settings, driver problems, or the game being very poorly optimized. Do not make the mistake of indexing these numbers to 100%. Apart from these, there are two more serious points often overlooked. One of them is the game you play. Not every game puts the same load on the CPU and GPU. Especially the esports games we just mentioned rely heavily on multi-core CPU usage. That's why CPU and GPU usage percentages in these types of games are not healthy references for bottleneck analysis. To analyze a bottleneck correctly, you need to take AAA games known to use the CPU and GPU in a balanced way as reference. We can list Red Dead Redemption 2, Cyberpunk 2077, and Alan Wake 2 as examples. Tests done with these games will give the most accurate result. During the test, you should either use the benchmark mode if the game has one, or try to trigger chaotic scenes where the PC is pushed to its hardest. Another very common mistake is resolution choice. As resolution increases, the load on the GPU increases. This means that the CPU can keep up with the GPU more easily. For example, let's take the RTX 4070 Ti Super and Ryzen 5 5600 as a reference. This duo can create a distinct bottleneck at 1080p resolution. However, when switched to Quad HD resolution, this gap closes significantly, both on the FPS side and on the usage percentages. If your goal is to build a PC focused on Quad HD gaming, you don't need to worry about this. I can easily say that at this resolution, most CPUs and GPUs work quite well with each other. So why did I say at the beginning of the video that it's a subject that isn't fully grasped by many people? Because contrary to a rather popular belief, a CPU and GPU bottleneck does not damage the PC at all. It only causes you not to get the maximum performance you could get from the GPU. This situation hurts your wallet, not your PC. With this logic, if you find an RTX 5080 that has dropped to the price of an RTX 5070, the first thing you should do is buy that graphics card without caring about the bottleneck at all. Because when you look at the price to performance or dollars per FPS ratio, you come out profitable since you aren't taking a loss. This issue is often ignored in the second-hand market, especially in some countries. Imagine the RX 6800 XT and RX 6750 XT are at a similar price. There are scenarios where the 6800 XT isn't chosen just because the Ryzen 5 5600 is too weak for the RX 6800 XT. Do not make this mistake. In short, unless you are buying an extremely expensive GPU for the CPU you have, don't be too obsessed with the bottleneck issue. Remember, when you turn off the usage overlay at the top left, you probably won't feel the difference at all. However, if you are still looking for a few CPU and GPU combos that balance each other out in terms of price, I will leave a few suggestions for you in the description and comments. You can check them out after this video. Next up is the other bottleneck I'll explain, the PCI Express bottleneck. But before that, there's something I want to tell you. These videos take a long time to make, but a large majority of viewers are not subscribed and don't like the videos. This negatively affects the views. If you want to support me, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment. That way I can make more videos for you. Now let's continue where we left off. PCI Express bottleneck. The PCI Express topic is actually quite a technical and detailed topic, so here I will touch on as much as you need to know from a bottleneck perspective. You can think of PCI Express as a highway. Expressions like Gen 3, Gen 4, Gen 5 represent the speed limit of this highway, while values like X4, X8, X16 represent the number of lanes. The speed and lane count of this highway directly limit the maximum data transfer speed reachable by the hardware using it. As PCI Express versions get higher, the bandwidth of the data lanes also increases. However, an incompatible or low PCIe version can prevent some parts from reaching their theoretical ceiling speeds. This situation is called a PCI Express bottleneck. Although the PCI Express interface is used by many parts, the main usage areas are graphics cards and M.2 NVMe SSDs. On the M.2 SSD side, this bottleneck is almost meaningless for an average user, because speeds over 1500 megabytes per second in M.2 SSDs are more than enough for daily use. To really feel the differences above this level, you need to be dealing with work like production, video processing, or heavy data transfers. The PCI Express issue in GPUs concerns everyone, but it doesn't always create a serious problem. For example, for a while, the PCIe Gen 4 X8 interface on the RTX 4060 was criticized a lot. However, since the amount of data these graphics cards could process couldn't exceed this limit in most scenarios, it didn't create a big problem in practice. Even when dropping to PCIe Gen 3 X8, the performance difference rarely exceeded 5 FPS in most games. That's why this situation starts becoming critical in RTX 4060 Ti and higher GPUs. The place where the real difference is felt is higher-end graphics cards. In very powerful GPUs like the RTX 5090 and RTX 5080, PCIe Gen 3 X16 can actually create a bottleneck in some games and usage scenarios. However, the picture isn't usually dramatic here either. For example, in a scene where you get around 180 FPS with PCIe Gen 4 or Gen 5, it's possible to see 170 to 175 FPS on PCIe Gen 3. So technically, there is a bottleneck, but we can say it doesn't pose a huge problem. The main point you need to pay attention to is this. If for any reason you have to drop to an X8 bus instead of X16, you can feel these differences much more distinctly. Especially using X8 on Gen 4 or Gen 3 instead of Gen 5 can create noticeable performance losses on such powerful GPUs. But then, there are still some outliers. Some very specific graphics cards like the RX 6400 and RX 6500 XT restrict the PCI Express bus excessively. These cards use the PCIe Gen 4 X4 bus, and since this lane is incredibly narrow, the performance difference between PCIe versions becomes exceedingly apparent. In summary, PCI Express 3.0, except for the X16 bus, is slowly starting to become outdated. PCI Express 4.0 is the most ideal and widely used version for today. If this is what your PC has, you can rest assured knowing you won't have issues anytime soon. PCI Express 5.0 is currently overkill for most users. Speaking of SSDs, if you want to get information about the memory crisis that has recently started hitting SSDs as well, and learn what awaits us in the future, you can watch my video on this topic after this video ends. Thus, we complete the 2 most frequently seen bottlenecks. So, what do you think? Have you ever experienced a serious bottleneck? Don't forget to share your experiences in the comments. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit the like button. If not, feel free to dislike it. Stay mysterious until the next video. Take care, and bye.